How much of your personal information are you willing to risk to help catch a criminal? For months, the KSL investigators have been asking about spy technology that law enforcement doesn't even want to admit they use.
Yeah, well, tonight, Daniella Rivera reports on what the high-tech tool can do and what happens to your information if it gets caught up in a digital dragnet.
They'll make what we call a stick, basically a single file line.
On this night, we're in West Jordan on an after-dark mission.
Listen, he's got a long criminal history.
Police, U.S. Marshal, we're not going away. We're going to breach this door. Open the door, do it now.
You're getting an inside look at the operations of VFast, a specialized task force going after Utah's most dangerous fugitives. They didn't find who they were looking for at that home. But when the old tried and true surveillance methods fail, police have a much more sophisticated tool that casts a wide net. While they may not be looking for you, they could still collect information about you, your data, and you may never know.
We don't really go into detail about any of our investigative techniques that we use.
There are 4 words U.S. Marshal Nick Chernis won't say in this interview: cell site simulator, and the brand name Stingray. It's a device that looks like this, or at least it used to. No one would show us what today's models look like. The device mimics a cell tower like this one, forces your phone to connect and share data. So if you're hanging out at home or taking the dog for a walk, you probably have your cell phone with you. And if police are using a Stingray device in your neighborhood, your information could be swept up.
That Stingray can then capture all of this information about everyone in the area, not just the person they're going after, but everyone.
Connor Boyack with the Libertas Institute in Utah calls cell site simulators a form of bulk surveillance.
Our phones are basically tricked into providing all this information.
How much information? We know police can track your phone's location and the devices it's communicating with, but what about your browser history? Can they see the videos you're scrolling through on Instagram? What about the texts, calls, and emails? The true scope of the Stingray's invasion of your privacy is secret by design. It's been widely reported that non-disclosure agreements have been used to keep it that way. But here's what a prosecutor with the Utah Attorney General's office said during a court hearing in March about law enforcement using this technology in Salt Lake City.
He very clearly says Stingray is being used in this area. It can pick up all cell phone chatter, all cell phone information within a 1-mile radius. That's what Stingray does.
Nate Wessler with the American Civil Liberties Union says these digital sweeps go far beyond a physical search of someone's home.
Police are not allowed to knock down every door in a neighborhood looking for a particular suspect. This technology is the digital equivalent of that in important ways.
And he says there's not much any of us can do to avoid it.
Either you have a functioning cell phone that is then can be tracked by a Stingray, or you turn off, put your phone into airplane mode and have a paperweight in your pocket. That's not a great option.
So how often are law enforcement using this spy tech? Well, that's another question they won't answer. And the KSL investigators reached out to more than 40 agencies across Utah. Most said they don't use Stingray technology, but some admitted they do, if not on their own, through partnerships with the feds. But the FBI, DEA, and U.S. Marshals would not answer questions about it.
It's sadly common, but I think unjustifiable for police to refuse to answer those questions.
The U.S. Marshals disagree.
If somebody knows our capabilities and our limitations, they know how to defeat them.
The KSL investigators found more than a dozen warrants granting the Marshals permission to use Stingray technology during a 2-year period. This one shows they helped Salt Lake police use a cell site simulator to find Book, the man now charged in the shooting death of University of Utah football player Aaron Lowe. He evaded them for a week, then was arrested within hours after they got this warrant. Most of these are for pretty serious cases and claim investigators had exhausted other options. We also found this warrant, though, for a woman who'd skipped out on probation in a shoplifting case.
Let's run them first. Let's run them.
The Marshals are not the only agency using the technology, but they're the ones we found with a consistent paper trail in unsealed warrants. Chernis says they're operating by the book. When needed, they get approval from a judge.
The U.S. Marshal Service and this task force don't evade any rules or regulations.
Congress hasn't taken action, but in 2014, Utah passed the most restrictive state law at the time, saying police can't use cell site simulators without a warrant.
We don't want to give government that kind of power.
Republican Representative Ryan Wilcox sponsored that legislation and says the challenge is writing policy that balances two competing interests, public safety and privacy. He remembers a Utah law enforcement officer telling him back then about accessing cell phone data.
They said, well, we caught these other bad people from doing this. We caught other criminals.
That didn't sit right with him.
Because you also violated another 2,000 people's privacy.
Utah's law also requires law enforcement to notify the owner of the cell phone they're targeting after the operation. But whether that happens in every case, impossible to know for sure.
Do you think the average Utahn going about their day knows this technology could be in use?
The average person has no clue that law enforcement has this ability at all.
It is virtually impossible to prove you've been subject to this kind of surveillance unless the government tells you.
So what happens to your information if it gets caught up in a digital dragnet? Well, if you're not the target of the warrant, Utah law says police should destroy your data as soon as reasonably possible. But again, there's no way for us to check to make sure that's actually happening.
It's very difficult passing a law like we did to then be able to follow up and see if it's being followed at all.
Privacy advocates now believe Utah law should go further and require police agencies to register these devices and then report back periodically on how often they're using them and for what cases. Mike and Deanie.
Yeah, pretty fascinating. All right, Daniella, thank you. Frightening situation for Utahns traveling I-15 through Juab County. You might remember last November, drivers reported somebody randomly shooting at them. One woman grazed by a bullet that ripped through her car. Prosecutors say Adam Geen was the man pulling the trigger. That arrest came months after the shooting and only after law enforcement used a type of warrant the KSL investigators have been looking into.
As Daniella Rivera reports, critics argue these warrants invade your privacy even if you haven't committed a crime but were simply nearby when it happened.
In the case against Adam Geen, drivers didn't know who shot at them, meaning law enforcement had very little to go on. So they used what's known as a reverse location search warrant or a geofence warrant. These warrants allow police to draw a digital fence around an area, then ask a company like Google to give them data from all the cell phones that were there around the time of the crime.
You're going to almost inherently have people whose information is being swept up who are not involved in the crime.
Leslie Corbley is a privacy policy analyst with the Libertas Institute in Utah.
These warrants really do sound like a fishing expedition.
They most certainly are. They're general warrants that seek caches of data on the front end that you then sift through to find a suspect.
Libertas calls geofence warrants an unconstitutional abuse of technology. Here's their reasoning. The Fourth Amendment says warrants must be based on probable cause and particularly describe the place to be searched and persons or things to be seized. By nature, they say most geofence warrants are lacking in particularity. That's the point. Police use them when they don't know who they're looking for. Like in the case of a freeway shooter. This investigator testified they went through the data of those who traveled through the area, then asked Google to give them more information about 4 specific people. That led them to Geen, but they're still holding on to the data from 3 others.
So the other 3 are currently under investigation.
There are checks all along the way.
Deputy Utah County Attorney Brian McBride says it's important for people to understand the cache of data law enforcement first receives is anonymous. Once they pick out relevant data, they can go back with another warrant and ask the company to unmask certain users.
The government has the duty to protect us and from crime and from overreach.
He points to a guilty verdict secured earlier this year against a man who kidnapped and killed a teenage couple in 2017. Prosecutors claimed data gathered using a geofence warrant and presented to the jury helped rule out the possibility of another killer at the crime scene.
Without it, there certainly will be crimes that are not solved.
McBride says he's only seen these warrants used in the most serious of cases. But research by Libertas suggests during the last several years, police use of digital dragnets throughout Utah has increased. The KSL Investigators reviewed several geofence warrants issued in Utah, most for investigating violent crimes like kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and murder. But these warrants filed by Layton police sought dumps of location data for lower-level crimes like car burglaries. For example, they got this warrant approved to track down someone who stole a credit card, then used it to buy gas and tacos.
Because it isn't a defined area of law, it's sort of the wild, wild west.
Republican Representative Ryan Wilcox chairs the legislature's Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice Committee. Over the summer, members signaling they intend to propose some sort of limits on reverse digital search warrants.
What we're talking about defining here is the details about what is appropriate to ask for.
As Utah lawmakers look to define what's acceptable here, challenges to these searches are mounting in other states. Earlier this year, a federal judge in Virginia ruled police violated the rights of innocent people by sweeping up their data for a robbery investigation. And a pending bill in New York seeks to ban geofence warrants altogether. It would be the first of its kind.
Our main goal of preserving our rights under the Fourth Amendment, so in being able to say with a straight face to our citizens of the state of Utah that yes, those rights are being protected.
Geofence warrants seek location data, but privacy experts say that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what police can get with a reverse digital warrant. Another example they gave, reverse keyword search warrants. They say these could land you in front of investigators solely based on your internet searches. Mike?
Yeah, pretty interesting there. Good digging around there. Thank you.